Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of M365 Voice. I'm Antonio Mayo.
I'm Sarah Haase.
And I am Mike Manorani.
And I think we're going to take another question from our jar today.
Oh,
Do you have
yes,
jar
I
ready,
almost
Sarah?
forgot, which is very necessary. All right, here we go. Antonio, near and dear to your heart here. When implementing Microsoft Information Protection, how do you know how many labels to use and whether or not you should use the default label?
Oh my goodness.
I love that subject.
You know my world too well. So that's a great question. I've seen a few different implementations of Microsoft Information Protection, or MIP. And there's a few different schools of thought on it, kind of how many labels you should have, what you should name them, picking a default or not. Microsoft's recommendation on this one is really sound, having a small number of labels, right? I tend to think that having 3 or 4 labels is ideal, at the very most 5. You might have a couple of sub-labels below that, but below some of those. But that tends to be my recommendation and preference, is keeping it around that level. 3, 4, maybe 5 if you really have to. How about yourselves? What have you guys seen? What do you guys think on that one?
In my world, I've done no more than 4. Basically, organizations wanted to keep it as simple as possible. I've done few of them as 3.
Yeah.
And then 4 was the most. I've never gone to 5. And I like that. I've never came across any scenario with any client that really wanted a lot of labels for MIP, because it will be a challenge to kind of convince them or make sure that we're not over achieving with that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
I would agree. I think 3 to 5 is the sweet spot. Interestingly enough, Microsoft, because they made it available recently, and when we publish out this episode, I'll put a link to it in the blog post, but they came out with an adoption pack of resources for MIP implementations, where they give you, for example, email communications, Word documentation, PowerPoint presentations, visuals, and everything. And their visuals and their examples, they use 5.
Yeah.
So I've seen, I've heard of 3, using 3 labels, 4 labels, 5. Any more than 5, here's where I think the biggest problem is. It comes down to an adoption perspective. How many labels do you think you can get your users to understand? Because Antonio, you and I have talked about this, and we're putting the power, or the responsibility, more than the power, but the responsibility on all of our employees to appropriately label their content.
Absolutely.
If we give them too many, they're not going to be able to distinguish as easily between those things, and our security posture is going to fail as a result.
Absolutely. Like, there's two key elements in what you just said. First of all, it's when an end user is going to classify a document or an email, you're relying on them to choose the right label based on the nature of the communication or the document, right? And by relying on them, the really important part of that is you're making them, your end users, your staff, your personnel, a core part of your organization's security strategy. So it's important that when you roll out those labels, that you educate them on what they mean, which is the right one to choose in which circumstance. Give them some good examples of when to choose a particular label, give them some examples of where you should not choose that label as well, so some positive and negative examples, and make it really easy to get to that guidance. And the naming of the labels is really important so that they can easily, at a glance, tell, oh, this is confidential, or this is highly confidential, or this is not confidential, or this can be public. So, having a small number of labels makes it much easier to understand what those things mean. The second big reason is when a user receives a document that's classified a certain way, they need to understand how are they supposed to handle that document. So when I receive a confidential classified document or highly confidential, what am I allowed to do with it and what am I not allowed to do with it? And again, a small number of labels that are appropriately named for your organization so that it fits with your business is really important for them to be able to, at a glance, knowing, oh, I'm not allowed to send this outside, so I won't. Again, making the end users part of that security strategy.
Correct. You want simple labels, not the Dewey Decimal System.
That's right.
And here's why, because other than me, because I'm obviously love all of these detailed classifications and taxonomies that go 27 layers deep, but your average user doesn't want to become an expert in classifying anything. They just want to send their email or save their document. That's all they want to do. So it's part of their job.
Exactly. Even before my current job, I worked in the data classification world, and the only times where I saw a larger classification schema, and that's what we would call it, a data classification schema, the list of your labels and what they mean. The only time I saw a more detailed one than 4 or maybe 5 labels was in military deployments. So when we would deploy to certain units in the US military, in particular, certain commands, they would use a particular data classification standard called CAPCO. Now, I don't know if CAPCO is still in use, but that I think had up to 7 labels, and it was 7 levels deep as well. So depending on what you would choose at the first level dictated what options you had at the second level, at the third, at the fourth. So it was really detailed. But this is the military, where they are mandated, right? They're ordered to classify things. So different contexts. I think,
and it's a control culture. So if we bring this back to an adoption perspective, culture is incredibly important. Then what you name these things has to match your company culture so that people identify or understand what the names mean, and how many labels and how, whether or not you even go with the default label, should also match your company culture so that you have realistic expectations of what you're going to get.
Exactly. Like when you start naming your labels, excuse me, your labels all end up with like the lowest sensitivity, generally, let's say. They end up with like the lowest sensitivity is something like public. You're going to name it something like that, right? Your highest sensitivity is going to be something like highly confidential or highly sensitive or restricted, something like that. You're then likely going to have one, a label that's just slightly less sensitive than that. Maybe it's called confidential or sensitive, something around that nature. And then you have this other one, which is all of that day-to-day business emails and documents and data that is not particularly sensitive. The world is not going to end if it accidentally gets forwarded outside, but it's internal content and it should stay internal. That is the hardest one to name, because some people call it general, some people call it general business. In the Canadian government, they call it protected A. And there's other names for it, but that's the hardest one to name. And that ends up being like 90% of your content, maybe, gets named that. And that tends to be your default, right? Because the vast majority of our emails and documents, I don't tend to think are really sensitive. It depends on your role, of course. For some people they are, for some organizations they are. Like if you work for a financial institution, often a lot of your content is going to be sensitive. So again, back to the culture point.
Inside joke for those that listen to all of our episodes, Mike's inbox is highly protected and classified. World Peace is documented in his inbox somewhere.
That's right.
So with that topic, how do you find clients respond to auto apply the labels? Do they trust the system, or do they have that resistance to say, I really need to classify it myself because I want to make sure it's properly labeled?
That's a great question. There's 2 schools of thought on that, and I read a bunch of research a few years ago, back around 2011 or 2012 on this. You in the data classification world, you used to have these 2 camps. One was all around user-based classification. So users are the ones that best understand content and can best choose the right label for a content. Right? Like even in the military, just because a document contains the word secret does not mean it's classified as secret, right? But automated processes might think so. So you had this one camp of user-based classification, and then you had another that said no, automated classification that used taxonomies and metadata schemes to automatically scan content. That is the most accurate way of classifying content. Then I read a bunch of this research that's actually tested this, and it finds that when you have user-based classification, you probably get about a 30% misclassification rate, right? So about 30% of your content is misclassified. Maybe that's because people are just accepting the default all the time. Maybe people are being overprotected and, just to cover themselves, I'm going to classify everything highly confidential just in case. You got a 30% misclassification rate. And then you look at the results of automated classification, and again, you had about a 30% misclassification rate. And what we have found in some of our data classification deployments, and this is before MIP existed, the best solution is usually a combination of the two, where you've got user-based classification where you can use the context of the content or the user, right? A person's understanding of the content can contribute to what is the classification of it. But then you also have automated policies that can double check, right? They can look, when you have an attachment in an email and way down somewhere in that attachment, you have a social security number. It can tell you, oh, you have a social security number in this, but you classified it as general or public. Maybe you shouldn't. So those policy tips in Outlook and the pop-up messages that MIP can bring up to tell you sensitive data is present, those are really, really useful. But my personal opinion is a combination of those two is the best solution. The automated classification policies by themselves, I find this is personal opinion only, I find they're a bit limited in their usefulness because they only look for sensitive data types and keywords, which are useful, but I don't personally think, unless you really are in a situation where documents that contain social security numbers are classified sensitive, documents that contain, emails that contain credit card numbers are sensitive. There's a lot of other stuff that we work on that's sensitive that doesn't have that, and that I find requires a person. Sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, I was just going to say, but I think Project Cortex and SharePoint Syntax and the content models could help with that, because I know that's something that if you can teach a content model how to read a purchase order, that typically isn't going to have a social security number in it. But if you teach it that some of these things are considered confidential information, then it could actually follow that and then apply labels on behalf of understanding content, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was going to say, I haven't had a lot of luck with the trainable classifiers when I've tested those, to be honest. But Project Cortex, SharePoint Syntax is looking really promising with its results around that. So being able to identify, oh, this document is a contract, and according to your organization, your contracts are considered sensitive, but not highly sensitive. That type of determination, I think, has a lot more context it can bring in to figure out, is this thing sensitive or not?
So Mike, when you work with clients on implementing this, how hard do you find it to help get them or to talk them through how to define a number of labels?
Oh, it is. The difficulty is to define the understanding of that, and basically what it means, like Antonio said, what it means to be highly confidential versus confidential or internal only, or in other world would be unclassified, that can be anything. It's not the number of labels, because I've never had any challenges convincing them that you should keep them as low as possible, between 3 and 5. It was more trying to educate them how to actually classify, or what is a highly confidential, and go and work with what I call them service champions to go and educate the mass users on those classification labels, because this is the hardest part, is to make sure that they understand how they classify exactly, like what Antonio said. This is the hard part, more than the number of labels in my previous experience has been.
Yeah. And to get back to part of the question, should you have a default label? I think that was part of the question. My recommendation tends to be yes, that when you do roll out MIP, you should have a default label, and you should make a clear decision. Should all emails and all documents be classified with MIP? And I tend to recommend yes. If you're going to roll out MIP, make a firm decision, educate everybody on it. Every document, every email must be classified, and roll out a default label, and roll out that the mandatory policy that they all need to be classified.
Now, here's the part where I think it's interesting, because I think it's also important what you call this data classification. Whatever you're going to refer to this umbrella as, please don't call it MIP or even MIP outside of your configuration and project team. I think you need to find a term that you can use to explain it to your users what you're asking them to do. And whether you call it data classification, whether you call it project classify, whatever you choose to call it internally, I would recommend that you think about calling it something that isn't a Microsoft product name that may change over time, and then you're going to have to decide if you want to change the name that all your users use to refer to the art the task of classifying things.
That is a great tip. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a great point. It helps to make the whole rollout of a data classification program part of your company culture, right? You kind of own it. You own the culture around it, the rollout of it. This is our program. This is our way of making all of our employees part of our security solution.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah. Let me ask you both a question. In your experience, have you seen companies or organizations try to make every label apply protection or encryption to documents and emails?
I have not.
Same here.
Okay. So I usually recommend that you don't make every label you roll out be one that applies protection. Because I find it interferes with the user experience a little bit too much, and not everything needs that. I've had to convince some clients, I've spent time trying to convince clients, no, you don't want to turn on encryption for every single label. And they'll often ask, well, why do we have this? Like, why are we rolling this out if we're not going to do that? And it does take time to understand that you know, the benefits of when I classify something, applying markings, that helps to educate everyone on what is sensitive and what's not. It takes time to convince them of the value of that, so that as part of rolling it out, you're not only relying on the encryption, because that use case breaks down sometimes, right? Mm-hmm. When you have something that's been forwarded to you, it's been protected for a certain group, and you legitimately need to share it outside the organization, that entire use case can break down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The way I look at it, and I tell people that don't just limit yourself. Keep it as open as possible with your labels and classification, because at some point you're going to run into a scenario like this and you're going to lock yourself out.
That's right.
It's important to be pragmatic, because when you get up into those the topmost classification level, and even the one down from there, that's when you really have to drop the requirements, and you require encryption. I mean, you have harder requirements, but let's be pragmatic with the rest, because we shouldn't act like everything needs a hammer, because it just.
That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah. So did we answer the question, Sarah? Do you mind repeating it?
We did. The question was, when implementing Microsoft Information Protection, how do you know how many labels to use, and should you have a default label? And I think we covered that actually pretty well.
I think so. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to you both. Great thoughts and opinions shared on that topic. All right. We'll see everyone soon.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.